And my second husband, he was also in prison. He was arrested in 1935 because he was from Leningrad. And after the murder of Kirov, they started cleaning Leningrad of everybody. In 1935, plenty of people in Leningrad were arrested. Well, he is sitting in prison in a solitary cell, where there are 4 of them. And one day they push in the 5th one. He is a kolkhoznik, you know what it is. And they asked him, what did they take you for? He said, oh, counter-revolution agitation. What did you do? Oh, I called the kolkhoz cow a whore. And he got 10 years, I think, or 8 years with it. You simply can't believe it. And then he started scratching. And one of the people one of the prisoners asked, just a second, show me your shirt. Lice. What did he do? He took a box of matches, emptied it, caught all the lice, put them in, and with bread, and then put one lice on his shirt and started banging at the door. What happened? Lice. And it was 1936 and a very hot summer, and they were just dying of heat. And shower only once in 10 days. So, oh, lice, this is... And they send them to the shower. And later, during the... Well, they let them out for about 15 minutes in the court to walk. They used to sell those lice for cigarettes.
Tatiana and I have been meeting and talking like this for 8 years now. We meet in her Moscow flat and exchange stories, most of which are hers. I do a lot of listening. Her life has spanned the history of the Soviet Union, of a brave new world that overestimated the human capacity and reaped the whirlwind. I come from Canada, a much more protected society, but a society which could sorely underestimate the human spirit. But there was something that helped us bridge that gulf of age and experience. We both loved telling stories. So, inspired by Tatiana and the hundreds of things she'd told me over the years, I decided to tell her a story. A film story about the Arctic, that frozen, floating world that connects our 2 homelands. An epidemic was sweeping the Arctic. It had been attacked by so many plagues over the years: TB, polio, influenza, alcoholism, AIDS, and now a new disease no one could find a cure to. A Dr. Rieu was sent to find out what he could. Drugs had no effect, and he was getting nowhere with his medical research on the Inuit, or Eskimos as he insisted on calling them. Months went by as he flew from one little settlement to the other. Every time he'd come back to base in Igloolik, Zebedee would come and sit with him. Rieu found him a rather annoyingly arrogant little man. Zebedee would go on about how shamans were the first doctors in the Arctic, how they'd learned their skills on the same vast plains of Siberia and Central Asia on which the plague had originally appeared. Rieu dismissed most of it as nonsense, but still the Inuk man persisted. Zebedee told Rieu his tests were a waste of time, and that if Rieu really wanted to understand the epidemic, he should go to a room in the old army base, way the hell out in the middle of nowhere. As the weeks went by, Dr. Rieu got more and more discouraged. He really had gotten nowhere. So, he gave in to Zebedee's nagging and left for the army base. It was strange, but as the night came on, everything felt different, like he was going into Zebedee's spirit world. Once inside the base, Zebedee's words started to come back to him. Zebedee had said that initiate shamans have visions where they go through a difficult passage into the underworld. There they meet their ancestors' spirits. It was like the room had been waiting for him. A light was burning. Books were open. The walls were plastered with pictures and stories. What else could he do? He began to read. The first thing Rieu came across was by Herodotus. He read how thousands of years ago, the Egyptian Empire destroyed 180,000 Assyrian soldiers who had them surrounded. As the night came on, the Nile subsided. Plague rats crept out of the graves of the Egyptians' ancestors who were buried in the riverbank. In the morning, not an Assyrian was alive, but the Egyptians were untouched. But plague rats aren't easily controlled. It was only a matter of time before the Egyptians joined the Assyrians in the graves along the Nile. Meanwhile, on the shores of the Mediterranean, the pharaoh kept a private zoo where 2 young polar bears dreamed of escape. The wall told Rieu how, later, the Greeks also suffered from a plague. They called it a miasma, noxious exhalations caused by an imbalance between human beings and their environment. Some Greeks fled, sailing north into a frozen world they called Arktikos, the land under the stars of the Great Bear. Rieu realized that that was just like Zebedee, who believed illness is caused by breaking a sacred code between man and nature. Zebedee said that the shamans were meant to restore the code, restore the balance. To do this, a shaman needed a spirit helper. The most powerful spirit helper was the Great White Bear. While Rieu kept reading, the room was getting warmer. In Viking mythology, there was a land of ice, darkness, and mist, which clung to the edge of the original abyss. It was called the land of Niflheim. When the earth warmed around 700 AD, the Vikings crept into Niflheim. Here, the warmth of your breath froze into clouds, like a miasma you could see. As the Vikings moved in, the original peoples of Niflheim withdrew further north. The Vikings stormed across the Arctic, plundering a world full of wonders. They took furs and falcons. They even tore the tusks from the narwhal and called them unicorn horns. The Vikings' greed shattered the sacred code between man and nature. The miasma waits for centuries until one day it sends its plague rats out from our ancestors' graves. The plague returned time and time again through history. It seemed to have a mind of its own. In the 1340s, the Black Plague swept out of the east, killing 1/3 of Europe. It even crept past the Arctic's cold by lodging in warm Viking bodies, spreading through human coughs and phlegm. Doctors of the Black Plague tried to draw out evil spirits, but their long claws, wax robes, and rose petals to sweeten the air were of little use to anyone but themselves. Doctors opened bodies to discover the cause of death. The system remained intact, untouched, except for 2 organs, the lungs and the brain, which crumbled like black coal dust. The plague seemed to seek out the only 2 organs controlled by human will, and there it would lodge. The Viking colonies had brought the seeds of their own destruction with them. The settlers' minds and bodies smoldered until they were only ashes, blowing in the snows of Niflheim. Soon after that, the original inhabitants of Niflheim returned, the ancient people who knew how to live on the edge of the abyss. Now, Zebedee had often spoken about living in the shadow of our ancestors. Like our European surgeons who found the plague in the organs of human will, Zebedee had said that Siberian shamans saw healing as pitting their will against the power of their ancestors' dangerous spirits. The plague transformed Europe. With so many dead, everything changed. Food became plentiful, castles lay empty, land fallow for the taking. So people had more money, but they wanted even more goods. A wall of possessions would be built to keep death out. The merchant class arose. The people who paid for the sculptures and paintings of the Italian Renaissance, who put up money for voyages of discovery to the New World to search for even more wealth. Ironically, the deadly surgeon of the Black Death had given birth to the modern European world. Meanwhile, up north, that peaceful land on the edge of the world lay waiting. Sibir means the sleeping land in the Yakut language. But Siberia, the Arctic, wouldn't sleep for long. The lust for furs drove European culture across the Arctic, across the ice, and on into America. In a few decades of guns, alcohol, and syphilis, the native Aleut people were decimated from 20,000 to barely 2,000. The room kept growing warmer, and bits of Zebedee's stories kept coming back to Rieu as he read all these things. One night last winter, Zebedee had told Rieu that to the ancient Siberians, illness was caused by the rape of the soul being stolen or betrayed. A shaman would have to search in the underworld and then fly up through the navel of the sky at the pole star, which opened into the heavens. The shaman would travel through time and space until the lost soul was found and returned to the patient's body. A little later, Rieu found a passage in Crime and Punishment. In it, Dostoevsky told how ideals can be betrayed, how the illness is spread, and how the soul of a whole nation can be raped. He dreamt that the entire world was ravaged by a strange and terrible plague. New kinds of germs attacked the bodies of people, but these microscopic creatures were endowed with reason and will. People attacked by them immediately became insane and violent. Yet never had people regarded themselves so wise and unshakable in their pursuit of truth as these victims. Never had they regarded their decisions, their scientific findings, their moral convictions so unassailable. Whole villages, whole towns and nations were infected and went mad.
Well, it makes some sense if you think of Inquisition. People who believed in God in this manner were heretics forever. They thought that he doesn't know that there is some people who just mislead him, who are real enemies of the people of the party of the Almighty.
She began to tell stories of women she'd known in prison, stories that made Rieu think of Zebedee, describing the ordeals of initiate shamans, not all of whom would survive.
There was Maya, the intellectual of the group. Having been in prison the longest, she was seen as a hard-bitten Trotskyist, but somehow there was more to her. It was much later we found she loved poetry, especially Mandelstam, oddly enough. Can you imagine a Trotskyist who loved Mandelstam? And Gulmira, on the other hand, was an innocent caught up in a storm. She cared nothing for our politics. Instead, she showed us more tender and practical things, like how to make needles from slivers of wood and use our hair as thread. All of this was lost on Katarina. She's been the daughter of some provincial party chief. Katarina never spoke to any of us. At first, she tried to impress the guards by praising every party hack she could name in a loud voice. Anyway, the guards didn't give a damn. Katerina could never get over this. She'd mumble conversations from her past. We couldn't reach her. She began to slip into the abyss that was always waiting for us. Finally, there was Dasha, the factory girl from Moscow. We called her our Madonna, but her sad eyes hid a much stronger soul. I think she was originally put in jail for making a lewd joke about Varia, you know, Stalin's henchman. But they never did break her, so she ended by telling us the jokes. The Russian people, when they start laughing, it means that they're almost in the ground. You see, they oppress them, and when they start laughing, it means they have no hope. If you don't laugh, then you better die.
By now, the walls of the room were steaming hot. In the midst of all this, Rieu found a supposedly true story, which he couldn't get out of his mind. In Ludwigsdorf, where the plague was raging with extreme violence, a young peasant girl was infected. As soon as her lover heard of it, he went to her in the night and indulged so long in lovemaking that he brought home a plague boil as a reward. A Dr. Eggerts happened to arrive in the town. The lover's parents begged him, for the love of God, to summon a priest to marry their children before they died of their sin. A few days earlier, the boils had actually burst. The doctor said to the mother, "As your children's boils have already burst, yet leaving them strong enough to go on meeting and making love, they will certainly not die of the disease."
За рекой знакомый голос слышится, да поют всю ночку соловы. За рекой знакомый голос слышится, да поют всю ночку соловы. Ах ты, песня, песня соловьиная, да чего ж ты за душу берешь? Ведь к любви ведет дорожка длинная. Шута стали вовсе не дойдешь. Ведь к любви ведет дорожка длинная. Шута стали вовсе не дойдешь.
Native Siberians believed that reincarnated bears would return if the skulls of the slain animals were piled up facing the sea. A resurrection. The guardians of Niflheim could return. The need for their healing grew with each new man-made wound. It was then Dr. Rieu remembered what Zebedee had said about how shamans learned how to cure sickness. Each shaman had a bird of prey mother, a great bird with an iron beak and hooked claws. It takes the shaman's soul to the underworld to ripen to maturity on the tree of life. When the bird of prey mother brings the ripe soul back to the shaman's body, it tears the body to pieces, giving bits to the evil spirits of disease and death. As each spirit devours a part of the shaman, so the shaman can cure each of these diseases. The bird of prey mother then puts the shaman's bones back in place. The shaman wakes, as from a deep sleep, alight with a luminous fire. Only by being reduced to bones, the very essence of life, can the shaman be reborn with the power to heal.
I can still remember, word for word, Evgeny Ginsburg's story of the men who came through their camp, the ones from Kolyma mines. Her story went like this. On the march back to camp, the men died. I was going to say like flies, but at Kolyma, the flies died like people. So in they came. I dished out the thin soup, filling the mess tin to the brim and holding it out for each of the creatures who filed before me. They looked as though they had just emerged out of one of Goya's nightmares. They were wrapped in rags that made our clothes look luxurious. Their faces black with frostbite, their mouth toothless and bleeding. I had to feed some nourishment into them. I had to keep going. They just kept coming. They held the mess tins in their numb fingers and took the soup as if it had the power of life. One of the men leaned through the hatch and said, "Hey, you make it a bit hotter, something to warm our guts." "It's boiling, comrade. Eat up," I replied. Then he shouted, "There's a woman here. Milka, come and look. It's a real woman, my God. It's 3 years since a woman gave me soup." He was just an ordinary Russian peasant, the father of a family. But for 3 years he had been living like a sexless beast of burden in the mines of Kolyma. I don't know. But I think receiving the bowl of soup from me had awakened human feelings in him that had nearly been crushed out of him. He came back a bit later and said, "Let's have a bit more. You're a decent girl. Say something in your woman's voice so that a man can remember what things used to be like." I leaned through the hedge and kissed him on his toothless mouth, surrounded with sharp stubble. Men, most of men, they died in the labor camp because they had to work very hard and they got very little bread. And to hard physical labor, you have to be fed well. And they lost their work. For instance, an engineer, a doctor, they lost the work they loved. It's the most important thing for a man, his work, isn't it? Women, they were more strong because they thought about their children. And anyway, they were much stronger. So they lived.
Those women stayed in Rieux's mind. He had thought the medical epidemic he'd been chasing across the Arctic was different from the plague they survived, but in his heart he knew it wasn't. Like shamans, these women's bodies had been torn to pieces and given to the evil spirits of disease and death. By being reduced to bones, to the essentials of life, they had found they could heal one another. They found the essence of survival is compassion. Rieux may have found an antidote to the plague after all. We are all victims of the plague because it has always been within us. But perhaps even deeper inside us, in our very bones, is the antidote. Dr. Rieu had once laughed when Zebedee said the northern lights are the flashing of shamans' spirits battling with dangerous ancestral spirits. Rieu finally knew what he meant. Within human breath is both the miasma of death and the warmth of life itself. Such things become clear in the Arctic, the land on the edge of the abyss. A land so pure, so cold, that as our breath leaves our warm bodies, the condensation immediately freezes, crackling in the night air. The Siberians call this the whispering of the stars. When we speak, our words crystallize in mid-air and tinkle to the ground as snow. There are places here where snow never melts, places where words still lie frozen on the ice, words of those like Zebedee and those women who have learned how to live on the edge of the abyss. But everything comes to an end, and even the polar ice shatters eventually. But for now, when the Arctic wind blows, you can still hear these frozen words flying across the land, words Zebedee would say every time he argued with Rieu. He'd say, "And yet, there is only one great thing, the only thing, to live, to see in huts and on journeys the great day that dawns and the light that fills the world." Dr. Rieu was never seen again. There was only one clue found. The burnt remains of books and stories were found blowing through an old abandoned army camp. I returned to Moscow a few months ago to find Tatiana with a broken hip, pretty well confined to her flat. Felled, but still struggling, still surviving, still exchanging stories with me. One story she told me was that right now, in Kazakhstan, in all the nationalist turmoil in Central Asia, doctors have been puzzled by the return of a disease long thought to have disappeared, the bubonic plague. The disease that swept out of this same area to change Europe in the 1340s. The disease Zebedee claimed first created shamanism 10,000 years ago. This made her smile, a smile that could accept everything. Everything, perhaps, but the plague. As she'd once said,
so that it should never happen again to anybody. I can drink more, but I have to be careful.
Дружок, валелёй, валелёй, лёшке, валелёй.